Everyone knew the name. The memes, the roundhouse kicks, the legend that said Chuck Norris didn't do push-ups, he pushed the earth down. For decades, the world treated him like he was indestructible. And then, on March 19th, 2026, he was gone. Just like that. 10 days after posting a video of himself sparring at 86, cracking jokes, looking unbeatable, he was gone. But here's what the memes never told you. Behind the legend was a boy who grew up ashamed, a man who buried secrets for decades, and a life full of loss that most people never knew about. Carlos Ray Norris was born on March 10th, 1940, in Ryan, Oklahoma, a small dusty town barely a dot on the map. From the outside, the Norris family looked like any other poor working family trying to get by, but inside that house things were falling apart. His father, Ray, was a mechanic and a truck driver, but more than anything he was an alcoholic. Not the quiet kind, the kind who disappeared for months at a time on drinking binges, leaving his wife Wilma to hold the family together with almost nothing. Chuck was the oldest of three boys, and he felt every bit of that weight. He described his childhood as downbeat. He was shy, unathletic, and only a C student. But the thing that cut deepest wasn't the poverty, it was the shame. Chuck was half Irish, half Cherokee, and kids in his neighborhood made sure he never forgot it. The taunts of half-breed followed him everywhere. He told the New York Times in 1993, "I had very low self-esteem, and I used to daydream about being strong enough to handle myself, to beat up the bullies." Instead of fighting back, he retreated inward. He found his male role models not at home, but at the movie theater. John Wayne, Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, men who stood for something, men his father never was. By the time Chuck was around 10, his father was gone for good. Chuck Norris graduated high school with no real plan and no real future mapped out. He wasn't athletic, he wasn't academic, he was just a quiet kid from a broken home with nowhere obvious to go. So in 1958, at 18 years old, he enlisted in the United States Air Force. It was less of a calling and more of a way out. He was stationed at Osan Air Base in South Korea, working as an air policeman. And it was there, almost by accident, that everything changed. He started watching the local men training in Tang Soo Do, a Korean martial art built around speed, precision, and power. Something clicked. For the first time in his life, Chuck Norris found something he wanted to be good at. He started training obsessively, every spare hour he had. It was also in Korea that the nickname Chuck stuck, given to him by the guys in his barracks. Carlos Ray Norris was quietly disappearing. Chuck Norris was beginning to take shape. He later told the Associated Press, "I played some football, but I also spent a lot of time on the bench. I was never really athletic until I was in the service in Korea." That admission says everything. The man the world would come to see as the ultimate fighter had to travel to the other side of the world just to discover he had it in him. But discovering the talent was only the beginning. When Chuck came back to the United States in 1962, he was discharged from the Air Force with a first-degree black belt in Tang Soo Do and almost nothing else. No career, no savings, no clear direction. He took a job as a file clerk at Northrop Aviation, just to pay the bills, training karate on the side, teaching out of his mother's backyard before eventually scraping together enough money to open his first proper studio in Torrance. Then he stepped into competition and got humbled fast. He lost his first two tournaments, dropping decisions to Joe Louis and Alan Steen, two of the most feared names in American karate at the time. He also lost 3 bouts at the International Karate Championships. For most people, that's where the story ends, but Norris was wired differently. He used every single loss as a blueprint. He studied what beat him, filled the gaps, and kept going back. By 1966, he was nearly unbeatable. By 1968, he had defeated Luis Delgado to claim the World Professional Middleweight Karate Championship, and then he held that title for 6 consecutive years before retiring undefeated. The shy, unathletic kid from Oklahoma had become one of the most dominant martial artists in American history. His studio started attracting a different kind of student too. Bob Barker, Priscilla Presley, Donnie and Marie Osmond, and then Steve McQueen walked through the door. And nothing would ever be the same again. Steve McQueen was one of the biggest movie stars on the planet, and he was training karate in Chuck Norris's studio. One day he pulled Chuck aside and told him, "You've got this intensity in your eyes when you fight that audiences might find appealing, could be profitable for you." Coming from McQueen, that wasn't a throwaway compliment. Chuck took it seriously and started pursuing acting classes. But before Hollywood could fully open its doors, life hit him with something no amount of training could prepare him for. In 1970, his younger brother Wyland, a private in the 101st Airborne Division, was killed on patrol in Vietnam. Chuck was in the middle of building his career, his studios, his future, and suddenly his brother was gone. He never spoke about it much publicly, but the pain ran deep. Years later, when he made the Missing in Action films, he dedicated them to Wyland's memory. Then came the break nobody expected. Bruce Lee personally invited Chuck to play the villain in the 1972 film The Way of the Dragon. The two had trained together, developed a genuine friendship, and Lee saw something in him. The film was a massive hit across Asia and put Norris's face in front of a global audience for the first time. But Hollywood still wasn't ready to hand him anything. The years that followed would test him in ways the karate circuit never had. While Chuck was grinding his way through Hollywood's back doors, taking every low-budget role he could find, there was a secret he had been carrying for years. Back in the early 1960s, during his first marriage to Diane Holchek, he had a daughter with another woman. Her name was Dina, born in 1962. And for nearly 3 decades, almost nobody knew she existed. Chuck had married Diane back in 1958, the same year he joined the Air Force. They were high school sweethearts, barely adults, starting a life together while Chuck was still figuring out who he was. They had 2 sons, Mike and Eric. From the outside, it looked like a solid family. But the secret of Dina sat quietly in the background for years. Chuck didn't publicly acknowledge her until his 2004 memoir, Against All Odds. He and Dina met for the first time in 1990, nearly 30 years after her birth. Whatever that reunion looked like, it happened entirely out of the public eye. Meanwhile, the marriage to Diane was quietly unraveling. After 30 years together, they separated in 1988 and finalized their divorce in 1989. 30 years, that's not a failed marriage, that's a lifetime. Whatever happened behind closed doors stayed there. Chuck never aired it publicly, which in Hollywood is almost unheard of. But while his personal life was fracturing, his career was finally about to explode. In 1993, Chuck Norris became Cordell Walker, a tough, principled Texas Ranger operating just outside Dallas, fighting crime every week with his fists and his moral code. Walker Texas Ranger wasn't the flashiest show on television. The critics weren't exactly lining up to praise it, but the audience didn't care what the critics thought. Week after week, millions of people tuned in, and the show quietly became one of the most reliable ratings performers on CBS. It ran for 9 seasons and nearly 200 episodes, an almost unheard-of run for an action series built almost entirely around one man. Then in 2005, something strange happened. The internet discovered Chuck Norris. The Chuck Norris facts meme exploded across forums and websites. Absurd, hyperbolic one-liners about his toughness and invincibility. Chuck Norris doesn't do push-ups, he pushes the earth down. Chuck Norris can divide by 0. They were ridiculous, and they were everywhere. A new generation who had never watched Walker was suddenly obsessed with the legend of Chuck Norris. What he did next surprised people. Instead of ignoring it or fighting it, he leaned in completely. He co-wrote the official Chuck Norris fact book, appeared on talk shows laughing at the jokes, and even used one of the facts in The Expendables 2. The man who grew up ashamed and invisible had become one of the most recognized names on the entire internet. But the controversies were coming. Fame at that scale comes with a microscope, and not everything Chuck Norris stood for sat well with everyone. He was a deeply committed conservative Christian, and he never once pretended otherwise. He wrote political columns, endorsed candidates, and used his platform to push his beliefs openly. For a lot of his fan base, that was part of who he was. For others, it was where things got uncomfortable. He made multiple public statements opposing LGBTQ+ rights over the years, speaking out against same-sex marriage and vocally opposing the Boy Scouts of America's decision to allow openly gay members. The comments drew significant backlash and opened up a sharp divide between the people who loved the legend and those who took issue with the man behind it. Then came the Roy Moore endorsement. In 2017, Moore was running for a U.S. Senate seat in Alabama. Chuck publicly backed him, calling him tough, tested, and with a spine of steel. Shortly after, multiple women came forward accusing Moore of sexually assaulting them while they were underage. Moore lost the election. Chuck said nothing publicly about the accusations. He had endorsed Donald Trump in 2016 and continued writing columns praising him in the years that followed. None of it cost him his core audience, but it permanently colored how a significant portion of the public saw him. The legend was intact. The man, though, was far more complicated than any meme ever suggested. In his final years, Chuck Norris began losing the people closest to him in a way that no roundhouse kick could stop. His mother, Wilma, the woman who had held the family together through poverty and an absent husband, who had raised 3 boys largely on her own, she passed away in 2024 at 103 years old. Then, just months later, his first wife, Diane Holchek, died in December 2025. The woman he had married at 18, the mother of his first 2 sons, the person who had shared 30 years of his life, gone. Despite everything, Chuck refused to slow down. On March 10, 2026, his 86th birthday, he posted a video on social media showing himself sparring with a trainer in Hawaii, moving with a sharpness that men half his age would envy. He captioned it simply, "I don't age, I level up." The comments filled with thousands of fans convinced he really was untouchable. 9 days later, he was rushed to a hospital on the island of Kauai after a sudden medical emergency. Sources close to him said that just the day before, he had been training, laughing, cracking jokes on the phone with a friend. Nobody saw it coming. On March 19, 2026, Chuck Norris passed away surrounded by his family. His daughter Danilee wrote simply, "My dad was my protector the moment I was born." The legend had finally met something he couldn't fight. Chuck Norris spent his whole life building an image of invincibility, and in a way it worked too well. The memes, the legend, the jokes about him never dying, they buried the real story underneath. The boy who grew up ashamed, the brother who lost someone in Vietnam, the man carrying secrets for 30 years, the father who outlived almost everyone he loved. None of that made it into the facts, but all of it made him who he was. The world lost Chuck Norris on March 19, 2026. The question is, did we ever really know him at all?